Mr. Steve Sarowitz to you. He's a very knowledgeable individual in many aspects. Steve Sarowitz is founder and chairman of Paylocity, a leading U.S. provider of payroll and HR solutions. In addition, Steve also serves as the CEO of Blue Marble, an international payroll provider, and director of Payscape, a UK payroll provider, a partner in Wayfarer Entertainment. He is also an international philanthropist with an interest in promoting unity by promoting universal education and advocating for the elimination of racism, sexism, nationalism, and religious prejudices. He also serves on the board of NCAT Company, an organization that builds a state-of-the-art training centers in urban areas. Steve was active in promoting the documentaries He Named Me Malala and Rosenwald. He serves an executive producer for the award-winning documentary Maya Angelou, and Still I Rise, and The Gate, Dawn of Baha'i Faith, a groundbreaking documentary about the founding of the Baha'i Faith. In addition to all that, Steve is married with and has 2 children and has a BS degree in economics from University of Illinois. I really appreciate Steve for taking the time to come and talk to us. He is a wonderful speaker, and thank you very much. Steve, we are all ears.
Well, it's my pleasure to talk to you tonight. I'm here to talk to you about progressive revelation. When I'm not doing the things you talked about, I'm at the temple when it's open. It's the Baha'i temple in Wilmette. And I'm making this presentation. Sometimes on the weekends, I'll make it 20 times in a day, just stand there all day long and tell people about it. And I think it's really the heart. There's a lot of things at the heart of the Baha'i faith. I think unity and the oneness of humankind are definitely at the heart of the Baha'i faith, the elimination of all prejudice. But progressive revelation is a really important concept. And that's because it unifies. To get to unity, we have to have unity of religion. And this concept of progressive revelation really unifies religion. I was raised Reformed Jewish. And so I was told that basically I was right as a Jew and Christians are wrong. And that didn't kind of make sense to me. There was a lot more Christians. Maybe they were right and I was wrong. But then there was a lot of Muslims. Maybe they were right and the Christians were wrong. And it was all pretty confusing until I heard this presentation on progressive revelation when I was still in college. I say about 100 years ago, actually about almost 35 years ago now. I was in college and I heard a presentation on progressive revelation, and it was the first time it made sense to me. So instead of thinking that there's a Jewish God and a Christian God and a Muslim God, there's simply a God. All of the holy books, even Buddha says there's a single God. And if there's a single God, then, and all the messengers said they were sent by God, then maybe logically it's the same God. And if it's the same God, and if we start looking at it more on a timeline, instead of thinking that these are all parallel, equal courses, what if they're the same course? A lot of people tend to look at religion like a spoke in a wheel. It's this one and this one and this one and this one, and we'll choose this spoke or that spoke, and they're all good because they're all passed to God. Well, I certainly agree that all religions are passed to God. In fact, from a Baha'i perspective, it's really one eternal faith. So instead of thinking it as of each religion is completely separate, it's one river, one flowing river, one book, and each chapter, each religion is a chapter in the same exact book. And so instead of saying they're all equal, and I can go to this path or that path or that path. There's no ors. The truth is all of them, and it can only be all of them, because it doesn't make sense that one is right and one is wrong when most of what they teach is exactly the same. That's the other thing, that when you really start studying religion, you find that the core teachings of each are spiritually the same. So, for example, every single major religion teaches us not to kill, not to lie, not to steal, not to talk badly about people, not to commit adultery, to love thy neighbor, the golden rule. If you look up the golden rule on Wikipedia, it's in every religion. The spiritual teachings are one. So what's different about religion? Why do we have some people that are Jewish, some people that are Christian, some people that are Muslim, some people that are Baha'i, some people that are Hindu? From a Baha'i perspective, it would be the failure to investigate truth, actually, because there's only one truth. Now, I don't have that truth, just so you know. I'm not that, nor do I expect that any of you are that smart, because truth is very big, but God has that truth. And I believe if you start reading the Baha'i writings, that truth has been unveiled in the Baha'i writings, in this idea of progressive revelation. So the idea of progressive revelation is that every 500 to 1,000 years, another messenger, another divine messenger comes. And that divine messenger comes when it's dark. They come to the worst place in the world. They shine their light. They suffer greatly. And then they leave a divine civilization behind them. And it's a lot easier when we look at them in their time and place, because sometimes their messages don't make sense outside of that time and place. For example, let's go back 4,000 years to Abraham. Has everyone heard the story of Abraham and Isaac, or Abraham and Ishmael, where he has to go kill his son? God says, go kill your son, and he goes to do it. So my question is, why? Why does God ask Abraham to kill his only son? Now, I know for Muslims it's Ishmael, and for Jews and Christians it's Isaac. I won't argue that point as to who's right. But why would God do that? Why does God ask Abraham to kill his only son? What's he trying to prove? It's a pretty popular story in the Bible and the Quran. I assume a lot of you have heard of it. Anybody want to venture an answer?
Yeah, I think because God wanted to see how devoted he was.
So to test his faith, right? To see how devoted he was. That's the answer I get. So I ask this question all the time when I'm at the temple. And so my next question is this. I have now he's 17-year-old son, but let's say he was a little younger. His name is David, by the way. And how do you pronounce your name? Madeline?
Yes.
So Madeline, I have my 17-year-old son, David, and of course he's stronger than me now, and I couldn't do this. But let's say I said to you, hey, God told me to kill my son, David, today. I'm going to go kill him. Would you just say, that's great, we'll wait for a ram like they did in the Bible and the Quran? Or would you call the police or tackle me or do what you could to stop me from killing my poor son?
Today, God would not do that.
Today, God would not do that. So it's exactly the right answer.
Where I could.
So you would stop me, which is good, because, and of course, like I said, he's too strong anyway, and I love him, and I wouldn't do that anyway. If anything, it would be vice versa, because he's 17. But back in the day, 4,000 years ago, was quite different. And what's different is that child sacrifice is quite common. And so this story makes a lot more sense when we understand that God is asking Abraham to do something that everyone was doing back then. It was very common. So it's a very common thing. And actually, the astounding thing about that story in context is not that he is asked to kill Isaac or Ishmael, but that he actually doesn't kill him. So this story represents the end of child sacrifice, the beginning of animal sacrifice. Of course, 2,000 years later, Jesus comes along. Moses codifies this animal sacrifice. That's what he does in the Torah. And then 2,000 years after Abraham, Jesus comes along, says, I'm the Paschal Lamb, and does away with the animal sacrifice and makes it a spiritual sacrifice. And that shows you how everything kind of moves that way, whether it be the equality of women or holy war or slavery. There's changes in each age that are followed. There's a pattern that follows. Let me go back to Moses, and I'm going to show you the pattern, and I'll go through each messenger and show you how the pattern of progressive revelation works. Moses, 3,500 years ago, he comes and he suffers greatly. He has to run with his people out of Egypt. The Egyptian priests want to kill him. That's always the leaders of the previous faith want to kill him. Always the messenger is sent to a very dark place. What happens, though, is Moses, even though he in his lifetime doesn't see this, he basically lays the seed. So think of this like a tree growing slowly. He lays the seed for a tree that grows into this beautiful kingdom of Israel. It's an incredible golden age for the Jews. Socrates and Aristotle actually learned at the feet of Hebrew scholars. It didn't just affect the Jews, it affected the whole world. And for hundreds of years, you have this amazing kingdom of Israel, from slaves, from nothing. Impossible that this would happen, but it did. The next one up is Zoroaster in Persia. Anybody Persian here? Raise your hand if you're Persian. I think I see a few Persian names. So Zoroaster, most people in the West don't know who Zoroaster was. He's not very well known, but he's pretty well known in Persia. So Zoroaster comes along and he's rejected. In fact, the priests try to kill him 3 times. They jail him for 10 years. Almost nobody listens to him. But eventually the king adopts his faith, the king of Persia. And that becomes the great Zoroastrian Golden Age, which on the whole lasts about 1,000 years. Has anyone heard of the Zoroastrian Golden Age? How about the Persian Empire, the Great Persian Empire? Because that's the more common name for it. So the Great Persian Empire, which was the center of, it was the greatest empire of its day. I think it was the largest empire of its day. It was definitely the most advanced of its day, was really running on Zoroaster's teachings. Now, 500 years after Zoroaster comes Buddha in India. And Buddha, like Zoroaster, suffers. He's exiled. He has to run essentially with his followers. He talks about his suffering. And yet behind Buddha comes a great empire. And this is not as well known. In fact, I didn't even know this till after I was a Baha'i. But there was a great Buddhist empire, very, very similar to the Persian Empire. It was called the Maurya Empire. So Buddha suffers, and yet what happens, he lays this seed, and again, this empire over time grows. And it grows to almost 2 million square miles, the Maurya Empire. And it was the greatest empire of its day. And when I say it was similar to the Persian Empire, it was a very large empire and a very well-run empire, and it was verdant, and there were inventions coming out of it. It was like light coming out of it. And the reason is it was running on Buddha's teachings, his laws. A lot of people nowadays don't think that Buddhism is even a religion, but it was a religion, very much like Christianity, and it still is today, depending on how you practice it. And these laws are designed for the time and place that they're unveiled. And when they're unveiled and used, it becomes a golden age. Now, the next messenger to come, I don't know if any of you have heard of him, is a messenger named Jesus. If you haven't, you have heard of him. So Jesus comes, and actually the thing is that nobody did hear of him for quite a while. He comes into this backwater of the Roman Empire. He wasn't Roman. According to the Baha'i writings, he only had 120 followers at the time of his death. And of course, he's not accepted. He's crucified by the religious leaders of that day. So it really looks like they're done. They washed their hands of this. There was a dozen messiahs. Why should this Jesus Messiah be any different? But he was different. According to the Baha'i writings, after 3 days, his faith was resurrected. The disciples went out with a resurrected faith, and they went all over. And they spread this new faith, and it spread like wildfire. In only 300 years, there was now millions of Christians in only 300 years. That's the tree growing slowly, but that's actually pretty quickly. And in 300 years, he did what he said he was going to do. He conquered the Roman Empire. So it became the Holy Roman Empire. That's what the Jews were expecting. So he was that king of the Jews, and he did conquer the Roman Empire. And he had a golden age that was really centered on the Byzantine Empire, which lasted for over 1,000 years. So the Eastern Roman Empire, this empire that springs up in his wake, is really the center of a grand and wonderful Christian golden age. Now, the next one is Muhammad. Now, Muhammad is very misunderstood in the West. A lot of people see Muhammad as a warlord. They see him as a womanizer, a polygamist. He did marry multiple women. He did fight in wars. But according to Abdul-Baha, the son of Baha'u'llah, Christ, Jesus, would have done exactly what Muhammad did if he was in the same position. So Muhammad comes to this absolutely awful, terrible place in Arabia, where they're burying their daughters alive. And the reason they're burying their daughters alive is that the men are killing each other so fast in war that the women have become expendable. And Muhammad says, first thing he says is stop killing each other. And again, almost nobody follows him. He eventually has to run for his life in exile. And it's many years before he takes up the sword, but he takes it up in defense, not offensively. He takes it up defensively to protect his people from being slaughtered. And he teaches love and kindness, mercy, compassion, justice, truth. He teaches all the things that Buddha taught and Zoroaster taught and Jesus and Moses, the same spiritual truths. And what happens is these people that were killing each other unite. And he unites the whole Arabian Peninsula, North Africa, all the way up to Spain in a very short period of time. And so it's the golden age of Islam. Does anyone know anything that was invented during the golden age of Islam, which lasts 500 years? Anybody know one thing they invented?
Wouldn't it be the zero, the mathematical zero?
I don't think they invented the zero, but they did a lot in math. They did algebra and they did algorithms and alcohol, maybe not their best invention in some ways, but yes, alcohol and alchemy, chemistry and university.
Yeah, chemistry. I wanted to say alchemy.
Yeah. And surgical instruments. I mean, really many of our building blocks. Now, where is European Christianity at this time? European Christianity falls into what's called the Western Europe, falls into the Dark Ages. So another thing the Muslims do is they're usually influential through the Moors coming up from Africa who take over Spain for 700 years, parts of Spain. They help spur something called the Renaissance. So they help lift Western Christianity out of the Dark Ages into the light. So if you really think of the Renaissance, it's thought of as a Christian thing. It's actually more spurred by the teachings of Muhammad and the innovations brought by Muhammad and the Muslims. One of the big ones that they taught, that the Moors taught the Spanish, is how to bathe, because the Moors had cities of 1 million people at that time. The Europeans relatively were living in hovels. So one thing that I've learned from studying this is that these golden ages extend to the entire world. Jesus came from everybody, Muhammad came for everybody, Zoroaster, Buddha, they all had universal messages. And this is in the Baha'i writings for their age. So basically, eventually this golden age of Islam dies. Europe has this Renaissance, and European Christians after the Renaissance, they take over the entire world. They take over most of Africa, most of Asia, North America, South America, Australia. And by the 1840s, the gospel has been spread all over the world. And in the 1840s, there are 3 major faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all waiting for a promised one. The Jews were waiting in 1840 for the coming of the Messiah, the Christ. And this was in a book called the Zohar, their mystical book. They expected him to come, they expected to return to Israel, and they expected a technological revolution. So, let me ask someone, have we had a technological revolution since the 1840s?
Sure, internet revolution, telecommunications.
And transportation, everything. So 75% of all the inventions in the whole entire history of the world, the pace of invention goes up 100-fold right around the mid-19th century. Okay, so now let me ask a question. I'll ask this for anyone. The Jews were expecting to go back to Israel. When did the Jews get to go back to Israel? See if anyone knows.
In the World War II, wasn't it?
That's when they get the country. But the actual migration starts in 1844 with the Ottoman Edict of Toleration. That's almost exactly the same time this new age of invention starts, is around the mid-1840s. So they all start together. So the Jews get 2 out of 3. They were expecting this technological revolution based on the Zohar. They were expecting a return to Israel, which they have. By World War II, Cheryl, what you were talking about, shortly thereafter they got the country, there were 600,000 Jews. Today there's over 6 million. So absolutely the migration back has happened. But the Jews didn't see the Messiah, so they're out. So they're out of it. So we have 2 other faiths left. In the 1840s, the Christians all over the world, and there were movements in Germany, in France, in Scandinavia, in Switzerland, in England, in Holland, in North America, you name it, Middle East, in India. There were separate Christian movements that sprung up expecting the return of Christ. And these were large movements. hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Christians, which was a lot of people at the time, were waiting for the return of Christ. These are large movements in all these countries. There are 700 ministers in England, 300 ministers in North America. Some of the big names behind it you might have heard of. Martin Luther, he predicted 1840. John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist Church, he predicted 1836. Joseph Smith and the Mormons was predicting all the time up until he died. He was predicting the imminent return of Jesus Christ. And the biggest one of all was a man named William Miller. Now, William Miller, he tells people that based on it's the 2300-day prophecy, Daniel 8:14. He says, in 2300 days, the temple shall be cleansed. And he calculates this out, starts at 457 BC when the temple was rebuilt. He adds 2300 years. He gets to the year 1844. And he ends up getting 100,000 followers. And they're all waiting on October 22nd, 1844, for the world to end. And Jesus is going to come back, the world's going to end, and they're all going to get raptured up to heaven. Did that happen? So Homa says it didn't happen. How do we know? Because we're here. And so this was called the Great Disappointment. This 100,000 people all over North America, they're waiting for the world to end. William Miller's predicted it doesn't happen in 1844. Now, interestingly enough, why did William Miller think the world was going to end when Christ returned? Because the Bible said so at that time. It has several lines where it says Jesus will return at the end of the world, Matthew 24:3, Matthew 24:14. There's several lines that used to say end of the world. When will this happen, Jesus? Now, all of those lines have been retranslated in the modern Bible to be end of the age. So it wasn't Miller's fault necessarily. He should have been looking for a new age, but the Bible at the time didn't say that. So anyway, this happened to all the Christian movements all over the world. They all end in disappointment. And we get to the Muslims. And in 1844, in Persia, the Muslims are waiting, actually in the year 1260, which is the year 1844, for the return of the 12th Imam. So in Persia, pretty much all of Persia, the 12th Imam has disappeared in 260. He's going to return in 1260, which just coincidentally happens to be the exact same year that Miller predicted. And pretty close to the exact same year that the Jews are waiting as well. Well, they're all waiting for the 12th Imam. There's a group called the Sheikhis. Most of Persia and some of Persia today was waiting for a 1,000-year-old man to come out of hiding. That was the standard Muslim expectation for Shia Muslims. But there was a group called the Sheikhis, and they were expecting a young man to come. And that's exactly what happens. May 23rd, 1844, the Bab comes. And he says, I am the promised one of Islam. May 24th, 1844, that technological revolution we spoke of starts with the first telegraph the very next day. What hath God wrought? By Samuel Morse. So now the Bab goes to Mecca. He publicly declares he comes back. He gets thousands and thousands of followers. In fact, in the end, he gets 100,000 followers. The king sends the #1 religious scholar to check him out. His name is Vahid. Vahid comes with a sword, very confident. The king gives him the sword. He publicly vows he's going to kill the Bab if he's not who he says he is, and he is pretty skeptical. After meeting with the Bab 3 times, Vahid says, if all the forces on earth were leagued against me, I would not abandon my confidence in this cause. It helps that the Bab reveals the equivalent of 1/3 of the Quran in their 3rd meeting, in a single meeting. So Vahid becomes a follower, never goes back to the king. And not only that, they try to put the Bab in jail. They basically are running out of options. They put him in jail. That jailer becomes a believer. They put him in another jail. That jailer becomes a believer. They put him on trial. He says, I am the promised one you've been expecting for 1,000 years. So now they've run out of options, just like they did with Jesus, and they have to kill him. So they go to get him out of his cell this month in 1850, July 9th, 1850. And the Bab says, oh, I'm sorry, you can't take me right now. No earthly force can take me until I'm ready to go. He was talking to his secretary. They take him anyway. They tie him up against the wall. They tie up a niece, a 20-year-old follower, around 20, who wants to be killed with him. Sam Khan, the executioner, gives the order. Approximately 750 shots ring out in front of a crowd of thousands. Now, We have eyewitnesses. We had a whole, this was done in a public square, so we know we have a lot of eyewitness accounts. The question is, when the smoke cleared. He said he couldn't be killed, but they did shoot him with rifles 750 times in a public square. Very unexpectedly, he wasn't killed, but we just know he wasn't. So we call it a mystery. What happened is the ropes were shot through, the Bab was nowhere to be found, and his follower, Anis, was standing there unharmed. They did a frantic search to find the Bab. Minutes later, they found him back in his cell, finishing his mission, which is what he said he needed to do. So he finishes his mission. He says, now you can kill me. So they take him and they tie him up a second time. He says, you can kill me now. And they tie him and Anis up the second time. And they have to get a whole nother regiment because Sam Khan refuses to shoot again. He pulls his regiment. They replace his regiment with a second regiment. Sam Khan was Christian. The second regiment was Muslim. And they shoot and kill the Bab. They don't stop there. By 1852, 2 years later, over 20,000 of the Bab's followers lie dead. They've been killing them all along. And the last two leaders are a woman and a man. The woman is Tahereh. Now, Tahereh was one of his first 18 disciples. Tahereh was absolutely brilliant. Tahereh, in 1848, she pulls off her veil in public, the first public meeting, and she announces that this is a new faith. People weren't sure that the Bab's faith was a new faith. They thought it might just be a reform movement within Islam. She said, no, it's a new faith. Tahereh, days after she does this, comes the first women's rights convention. One of the things that Tahereh said, she said there's new laws, and she said one of the new laws is that women are absolutely equal to men. This was in a day when all around the world, women couldn't own property in many places, couldn't be educated, couldn't work most jobs, couldn't vote anywhere. And yet Tahereh pulls off her veil in a place where women are never unveiled, and Tahereh says, women are equal. So in the United States, in Seneca Falls, days later comes the first Women's Rights Convention. Now, meanwhile, Tahereh back in Persia is teaching this new faith brilliantly. Male scholars try to argue against her from behind a curtain. As all the leaders of this movement are getting killed, the king, he notices or hears about her great beauty and offers to marry her. Tahereh says, no, you keep your religion, I'll keep mine. And she keeps going, and eventually they are going to kill her. She puts on her wedding dress before she's killed, and she says to them, you can kill me as soon as you like, but you cannot stop the emancipation of women. And so beautiful and brave and brilliant Tahereh goes to her death, which leaves one more leader left. The last leader remaining in 1852, last major leader, is Baha'u'llah. And Baha'u'llah, the glory of God, is the son of a nobleman, one of the wealthiest men in Persia, known at a very early age for wisdom, like Jesus was. The leaders of the town around 12 or 13 are all together around him, asking him questions. He is known as the father of the poor by his early 20s, turns down a provincial governorship at 22, becomes a follower of the Bab a few years later, very loyal leader and wonderful leader in the Baha'i faith. And in 1852, he's the last one standing. They arrest him. They would have killed him, but he was too popular. They arrest him, put him in a place called the Black Pit, and they nearly kill him in the Black Pit. 100-pound chains on his shoulders, 3 stories underground. It's an awful place, chained to other people. It's in the Black Pit that Baha'u'llah sees the vision of a maiden. The maiden says, you're the promised one of all faiths. Essentially, he's the Christ returned for Christians. He's the 5th Buddha. He's the 10th avatar. He's the Messiah. Christ returned also for Muslims. He comes out of the Black Pit, and for 40 years, he's exiled. He's never home or free again. Finally exiled to the worst prison city in the Ottoman Empire, which is Akko, Palestine. So Baha'u'llah reveals over this 40 years of exile, he reveals the equivalent of 60 Christian Bibles. And his message is essentially this: I've come for all humanity with the most great peace. We get this most great peace when we understand the oneness of humanity. So he says, first of all, women and men are equal, just like the Bab said, still very radical. There's only one race, the human race. The earth is but one country, mankind is citizens. So get rid of sexism, get rid of racism, get rid of nationalism. And then the big one, get rid of religious prejudice. He says it's one religion, one faith of God. It's not competing faiths of God. He says all of these competing religions are chapters in a single book, and they're each beautiful and mystical and magical chapters in the same book. And he says, don't think that one chapter is better than the other. Not Baha'i, not Christianity, not Judaism. They're all chapters in the same book. And all the chapters are about love. That's what Jesus was talking about. Universal love. And that's what Moses was talking about, and Buddha, and Zoroaster, and Krishna, and Muhammad. Every one of them was teaching universal love. And he says now, finally, humanity is able to hear this on a global basis. He said this in the 1800s, before we had airplanes, before we had the internet, before we had Zoom even. And yet he knew we were going to have this. And so he gave his message. And so that's what Baha'is work for every day. That's what we're in. This Baha'i era is what we would call it. And it's the era of world peace. And so that's what our faith is about. That's what his message is about. And this is the fulfillment, really, of all those predictions in the Bible and the Torah, the Quran, about a promised day to come. And so that's really where progressive revelation is at the moment. So that's kind of where I usually end. And I'd love to open it up to any questions.
We spoke about the various golden ages which are affiliated to the respective prophets and manifestation. What is the expectation of this Baha'i era?
So there will be a Baha'i Commonwealth, which will be worldwide. So if you look at the golden ages, if you go back all the way to Abraham, for example, Abraham had a burgeoning civilization, but it's relatively small that he left in his wake. Each one gets bigger. So it's progressively greater unity. This age is the first time where we're going to have global unity. And so this is actually what we're going to have is world peace, and we're going to have a single world federation. So think of it like the United Nations of the world, just like the United States of America. Think of it like the United Nations of the world. And so we're going to have global governance, and it's going to be based on these Baha'i principles of unity, of oneness of humankind, the whole idea of oneness. We're going to have a golden age unprecedented in the history of humanity. And it's not because Baha'i is one iota better than Christianity or Judaism or Islam or any faith that preceded it. It's because humanity is ready for this golden age. And we will see incredible advances in everything, healthcare, education, quality of life, because we'll lay down our weapons of war. Imagine if we laid down our weapons of war and cooperated on an international basis, how fast we could move forward. And that's what will happen.
Steve, you talk about progressive revelation and how beautifully all these religions are connected. So why is it that the people of the world are not in tune with that? Why is it that they don't recognize it and they say what they have believed, what their fathers have?
Because we failed to investigate truth. What's happening now is the younger generation is walking away from religion. So the younger generation, my children's generation, college age kids now, my kids are going to be in college in a year and a half, but the kids in college, kids in high school are literally in unprecedented numbers walking away from religion. They're kind of going through the first phase. The Baha'i faith says we'll walk away from religion first because we'll see it's not working. And then we'll come back to it because we'll realize that doesn't work either. I think we're in the walking away phase. I don't think it's going to last that long. We're going to realize we need religion. And when that happens, that's when the Baha'i faith will grow more than ever, when people start coming back to religion from walking away. But the reason why people follow blindly the religion of their forefathers is because they're not questioning. Baha'u'llah said it's important that we question. Now, it's perfectly fine to follow the religion of your forefathers, but Baha'u'llah says you must question and really on your own decide what you believe, not just believe what your parents believe because they believe it. And that's very important. If we don't investigate truth, we'll have religious conflict forever. And so it's very, very important for us to investigate truth without prejudice. Madeline, you had a question?
Yeah, I read in DW.com today that UN leader said that this pandemic showed that there is inequality on Earth. that I don't know what it takes, because after reading Universal House of Justice's letter last week in Feast, that Baha'i faith is kind of small number and our resources are limited, and we're not able to enhance the world substantially. It's very frustrating for me to, it's like I'm anxiously waiting for something to happen. In fact, I thank God, if it wasn't for this virus, I don't think we would have talked with you right now.
The racial unrest also, the same thing. It's all about the lack of, according to the NSA United States, the National Spiritual Assembly, it's about the lack of acknowledgement that we're one human race. And that we, this inequity is a problem. It starts in our hearts. So we are, and I'm not a great example because I'm very wealthy of the inequity, but I'm working with my wife. I don't intend on dying extremely wealthy. I'm working on taking our fortune and giving a lot of it away, the bulk of it away. But if you look at how our world is designed, we're not trying to use our resources and spread our resources. We're very materialistic. And in many ways, we've turned from God. And I think what COVID is doing is it's bringing God back to a certain extent. There's an old saying that there's no atheists in a foxhole, which they said in World War I. And I believe that's the case. We're in a bit of a foxhole now. We're in a bit of a time where people's faith is being tested, or people's lack of faith. And when I first year I was a Baha'i, to your point about Baha'is being small, I was so concerned about that. I told everyone I met about the Baha'i faith every day, with a huge hope that every one of them would become Baha'i, because I knew if I didn't teach the Baha'i faith as fast as I could, that the Baha'i faith would die, of course. And after about a year, it suddenly dawned on me that I didn't matter at all, that Baha'u'llah had everything, and that I was really not having faith by doing that. And so I still teach the faith to almost everyone I meet, if I can, but I don't worry about it now, because I know that God is in charge. And so I'm not worried about the Baha'is being small. I'm not worried. All I can do is what I can do. And of course, with my resources, I can do more than most. But each of us can do what we can do. I tell everyone that the Baha'is, Baha'u'llah, have a plan for world peace. And it's unparalleled based on anything I've seen. And if you have a better plan, I'd love to hear about it. And if it's better than the Baha'i plan, and it's a different religion, I don't care, I'll follow it. But if not, you might want to consider doing the other and reading what Baha'u'llah had to write and deciding for yourself if this might be better. And if anyone thinks world peace and unity is not important, then they've been covering their eyes the last few months. It's extremely important. And I believe that this roadmap that Baha'u'llah's left behind him is by far the best chance for humanity, the only chance for humanity.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Let's see, I'm gonna check the chat. Okay, so is unity embracing the inevitable differences in faith or faithlessness from a diversity of persons around the world? Is unity oneness or an embrace of difference? It's both. So unity is actually unity in diversity is what we call it as Baha'is. So unity in diversity means that we're gonna have different ideas, even amongst Baha'is. We read the same writing and we have two different understandings of it. But unity amongst Baha'is, the more we immerse ourselves, Baha'u'llah says, immerse yourself in the ocean of my words. The more we swim in the ocean of his words, the more we get unity. Because at that point, we're starting to understand these concepts on a deeper level. But there's diversity. We're different colors. We have different ethnicities, different nationalities, different genders. We have different viewpoints. We have different ideas. Some of us are more conservative. Some of us are more liberal, naturally, and that won't change. But what is the unity? The unity is God and his messengers. If we turn towards God and his messenger, we have automatic unity. And we can still have many, many differences. As far as faithlessness will never lead to unity. It will lead to disunity because there's nothing to unify on. So if you tell me, and I have a friend who's an atheist who's trying to build an atheist church around the world, and I told him, you're wasting your time. We're friends, so I was very nice about it, but I basically told him he was wasting his time because there's no there there. there's nothing, there's no book, there's no instructions, and there's no principles to live your life by. So, and what's happening, and he told me this, is, you know, it's falling apart because everyone does their own thing. There's no unity there. Yes, an atheist place of worship is a bit of an oxymoron, but they missed the tradition that they had with Christian church, and they missed the community. So they're trying to build a community. They're trying to build a very open community, which is actually laudable. But the problem is, and this is where if you get to the atheist, the problem with it is that you don't have any guidelines. And that's really one thing that comes from religion. Did somebody have a comment?
I was typing in the chat, I had those questions. I completely connect and appreciate what you expanded on just there, especially as it relates to developing those values and like principles with that community through religion. I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, I think one of the things, so here talking about that, one of the reasons that youth are running away from religion so quickly is they see religion as harsh and judgmental and divisive, and it can be when used improperly. Religion is this very powerful tool, and if it's used improperly, it divides people. And what Abdu'l-Baha says is, if religion is used this way, if it becomes a source of strife and conflict, it's better to have no religion. Abdu'l-Baha, the son of Baha'u'llah, who says this. But religion, when used properly, he says, is the salvation for humanity. So when we look at religious law, it has to be looked at as a loving gift imparted upon us by God for our sake, as a gift, but not a punishment. Law is not punishment, it's a gift. He's saying, this is the right way to live. If you do this, you'll be happy, you'll be fruitful. If you don't do it, it shouldn't be hellfire. If you don't do it, it should be your own choice. So, in other words, it's not my job to tell anyone how to live their lives. Baha'u'llah has told us how to live our lives. He has a very, very clear way, he said, and he says we're developing a new race of men and women. And so I think it's very important that all laws must be put out there with love and kindness and not intolerance and hate. And that's the problem. I think that's why a lot of young people are running away. I have friends who are Sunni. This is the next question. I have difficulty having them be open to the writings due to the Bab and Baha'u'llah being of Shia lineage. Any guidance we can offer? Everyone has their own doorway to the faith. And so, the question I have, let me ask you a question, and maybe you can answer this question. Are they open to the idea that the Mahdi and Isa, Jesus, will return? Are they open to that?
So I'll just take myself off of mute. I think that they're open to that. I think that where we keep hitting potential roadblocks is discussing that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was the seal of the prophets. And so I think that, we get stuck within that loop of he was the seal of the prophets. There were no more that would come after him. The Quran was the last book. And because I come from that background as well, I'm just beginning to have them understand that I haven't betrayed the Prophet or my faith by embracing the Baha'i faith and Baha'u'llah as well.
Well, Abdu'l-Baha always started by agreeing. So I agree that Muhammad is the seal of the prophets. And the question is, what is the seal of the prophets? So if you actually read the Quran in Arabic as it's written, he is the certification or stamp of the prophets. That's what's said there. It does not say he's the final prophet. It says he's the stamp of the prophets, the certification. Have you seen the statement by Baha'u'llah? I believe it's in the Yagan, where he says, this is the Kadabi Yagan, the Book of Certitude, where he says, if any one of the messengers, any one of the prophets said he was God, that would be correct. And if they said he was a messenger of God, and if he said he was a servant of God, all of that would be true. And if he said he was the seal of the prophets, that would be true. Have you seen that?
I've heard that. Yes.
So if you can look that up and read that particular passage should be helpful, because it kind of shows you the different ways to look at it. One question I have, and it's really a logical question. It's kind of a ridiculous expectation that Muhammad is the seal of the prophets. And they do expect Isa or Jesus to come back, right?
Right.
So if Isa or Jesus comes back and Isa says hello, is that divine revelation?
I think that they almost expect Muhammad or Jesus to come back as Jesus, not as another name, not.
But let's say he came back as Jesus. Let's assume everything they expect is exactly. Just hold them to follow their chain of logic. Don't change a single thing. So Jesus comes back. He's going to come back as Isa, and he's not allowed to say anything, because anything he would say would be everything that Jesus says or Muhammad says is revealed word of God. So he's not allowed to reveal the word of God, right? So is he coming back as a deaf mute? I mean, seriously, how can he come back and not reveal the word of God? If he talks, he reveals the word of God. If he writes, he reveals the word of God. He can't communicate in any way. It would be divine revelation. Have you ever thought of that? It's kind of how
I love that logic. I love that logic. And I think that that's a place to go. I mean, I think part of it is, that you have some people who are Muslims. It's funny, more of my Shia friends are open to learning more about the Baha'i faith than my Sunni friends. And so, but I refuse to choose a team because I said, I'm what Muhammad is. And they're like, well, you have to choose a team. I'm like, I'm not going to. So I was always a rebel anyways, but I love your logic. And I think that that's definitely something that I will ask them. So what does that look like? And how do you know if you see him on the streets?
And if you can get them to read the writings, that's really good, because once you get into the writings, it's really hard to deny that. Another question I always ask Muslims is, if you have a Christian who just simply won't believe in Muhammad and they won't read the Quran, how do you get them to believe in Muhammad? And of course, they're a little flummoxed, because without reading the Quran, how would you get them to believe in Muhammad? Muhammad's greatest miracle is the Quran itself, according to Muhammad, right?
Exactly.
So then you say to them, the next thing, of course, they'd say, well, they'd have to read the Quran. Well, then why don't you read the Baha'i writings? And, you think a messenger can't come, but there's another thing. It's Surah 560, I think it's 564, something. I can't remember the exact surah, but it's the one that says, there's several of them that say that the Jews were cursed for binding God's hands. It says in the Quran. And so, Muslims will never say that God's hands were bound, because they know the Quran says don't do that. Mm-hmm. Are you telling me that God can't send another prophet? And you have to ask them that. Can God not send another prophet? And of course they say, yes, he can, but he said he wouldn't, right? Well, we have evidence that he did, because we have these two prophets. So you should read what they wrote, and you can decide if they're prophets. And if they're prophets, then obviously God did send a prophet, and then your understanding of the Quran is wrong. And if they're not prophets, okay, then I'm wrong. But you should look at it and determine, because the evidence is there. We know God can send a prophet. You believe the Quran says he's not going to send a prophet. By the way, there's Surah 31:27. I'll give you a couple verses that I refer to. 31:27 is, you know the Quran well?
Yeah, fairly well.
Okay, so this is the one that says, if all the trees were pens and all the oceans were ink, that one, God's word would not be exhausted.
Yes.
And has it 7 more oceans besides, something like that? I have to go back and read it. I haven't read it in a while. But anyway, it starts with, if all the trees were pens and all the oceans were ink, God's word would never be exhausted. Mm-hmm. And yet you're telling me God's word is exhausted. Another one is Surah 13:38, which is a really good one, which is talking about every age has its messenger and every age has its book. Well, are you saying that Muhammad's age lasts forever? So, again, that's illogical, like age, because Muslims know, a knowledgeable Muslim will know that there was age, always a prophet for every age. Every age has a messenger, every age has a book. And we're quite obviously in a new age, going back to my speech. So you mean there's no messenger, no book for this new age? Is this the age of Muhammad? We know it's not. It's not logical. Anyway, there's a couple things for you. Is that helpful?
That's amazing. Thank you.
So we're going on to atheists. From Josh
Steve, I'd like to say that quote that you were trying to find. I'm not that smart. We studied this morning. That's why I have it in front of me. He says, it's in Quran 18:109.
Okay.
And he said, if the whole ocean were ink for writing the words of my Lord, it would run dry before the words were exhausted. Even if we were to add another ocean to it.
That's a different one, but there's Surah 31:27 is almost the exact same thing. I'm just gonna pull it up and I'll put it in. I'm gonna put it into Surah 31:27. I know there's different. I'm gonna paste it right now, and it's, if whatever trees upon earth were pens and the sea was ink, replenished thereafter by 7 more seas, the words of Allah would not be exhausted. Indeed, Allah is exalted in might and wise. So it sounds like they, as the Quran does often, it has the same thing happening again. But absolutely. Oh, anyway, I wanted to go back to atheists. Okay. Going back to the atheist question. What ideas do you have to get atheists more accepting of the Baha'i message when most cringe when you say the word God? As a young person who just declared recently, that was a step I had to get over. I want to do a group gathering called Setting Intentions to get people from all beliefs and spiritualities together. What I say to every atheist when I meet them is this: I don't believe in the same God that you don't believe in. This is from Abdul Baha. I don't believe in a God of war, of intolerance, of hatred. I don't believe in a God of hypocrisy. I don't believe in this harsh, judgmental God that some people seem to believe in. I don't believe in that God. But I do believe in love and kindness and mercy, compassion, justice, truth. And these things I call God. Do you believe in these virtues that I mentioned? And 90+% of the time they do. And then we can have a conversation. I believe that atheists reject religion, not God. I believe that atheists have seen the hypocrisy in religion. Sometimes I talk to them about how they became an atheist, and I believe more often than not, there was something along the lines where an atheist decided that this is BS, I don't like this, and I don't believe in this God. And so I basically say, well, you've rejected religion, and by the way, correctly, I reject that same religion. I reject a religion where my religion is right and yours is wrong. I reject a religion where you have to do this or you're going to hell. I reject all of that. So we reject the same things, but I like these things, love and kindness and mercy and compassion. And I believe this is true religion, and this is the God that I know. And by the way, from a Baha'i perspective, God is unknowable. It's not a person in the sky. God is not knowable to us. All we know of God is these traits. So literally, if you believe in these traits, from a Baha'i perspective, you believe in God. I don't want to use the G word because you may not like it, but you believe in the higher power, you believe in the something that I would call God. Is that helpful?
Yeah, that's good. I was just thinking of if you could give examples of different things that you would suggest to get people who are maybe on the verge, where they're not necessarily atheists, but they don't, like the spiritual, kind of like my generation. We don't really know, there's a lot going on in the world right now. We don't really know how to react. We want a community, but we're not willing to get behind any sort of religious doctrine or anything like that. So how do you get people like that? That's why I had mentioned about this Setting Intentions group I wanted to do, so that we could get people like that I think are more willing to listen to the message. Like you're saying, the 90% of people. So what would be other things that you would recommend to get people like that?
Elevated conversations. Start talking about unity. Start talking about solutions to today's problems. Start talking about how do we start talking about the problems of today and having elevated conversations. And you can use the word spiritual, but not religion. And then you also want to say an open conversation where we look for spiritual solutions to today's problems. So you want someone who's open to spirituality, at least. You don't want someone who's a hardcore atheist. And you may lose a few out the door that way, but I think if you just have open conversations and you say, look, this is not indoctrination in a religion, but we want to have these open, elevated conversations. And I think if you take the themes of today, how do we get rid of racism? Racism is great. And you can bring in the Baha'i writings because they're beautiful. But if you're starting to talk about racism, we're doing this in my community, we're talking about racism, and we're getting many, many non-Baha'is. We had about 200 at our most recent. We had Joy DeGruy, which helped, and we advertised it pretty heavily. But we had a panel talking about racism, and we did quote the Baha'i writings, but it was more of a general thing about racism. And so I like the idea of doing a lot of social justice, because I know that your generation is into that, and I think that you can mix in the writings, and eventually, I'm a pretty bold teacher. I teach directly in the faith, and I go with people who are spiritual and not religious. I go right into it, and I go right into progressive revelation. But the problem is you have to get people in the room to do that. So I have the advantage of doing that at the temple where people are in the room. And I find that people like you're describing, who are anywhere from atheist to agnostic to spiritual and not religious, are very touched by these ideas of progressive revelation and very touched by Baha'u'llah's teachings. But you have to get them in the room long enough. And so I think the way to get them in the room, and the way the NSA is doing this in an organized basis, the National Spiritual Assembly, is through elevated conversations, not through direct teaching of the faith. And then that leads, for those who are interested, into direct teaching of the faith. So you take the things that Baha'i faith does. The immigration, you could talk about immigration. Are we one world, And then you actually, but in all these conversations, you can bring in the faith, but not too heavily. For those you do bring in the writings, and then you take some of the people there, some percentage will want to actually study the faith. But you start with an issue that people are interested in today. Any other questions? I think my advice to those of you who are Baha'is is teach boldly. There's, as to one of the earlier comments about the frustration, the world obviously has a lot of problems, and I believe that Baha'i writings have a lot of solutions. And so don't be afraid to tell people about these solutions. Don't be afraid to shout from the rooftops. And now what I've noticed is that receptivity has gone through the roof, that people really want to know answers. The other thing is on things like racism, because I've been right in the middle of that in terms of fighting it for years, actually, but much more so in the last couple of months. And so we need this background of faith and love and unity, and this understanding that we're one human race and that we're not trying to tear any soul down, but rather create justice. We need that viewpoint to really help us arrive and to fight this terrible disease of racism. But we need to do it with justice and love and kindness.
Steve, I have a question, if I can.
Sure.
Like 100 years ago, when Abdul-Baha came to United States and Europe, and he explained about the Baha'i faith, many think that Abdul-Baha put a blueprint, basically, or gave a blueprint to the humanity to solve the problem. But after that, we had 2 wars, we didn't pay attention, or the humanity didn't pay attention. Now, do you think now, in this age, like 100 years, or 102 years or something after he came to United States, is the means of getting to the world peace or lesser peace or getting a global government, is that the time for it, or do we still have to wait for a few more years?
That's up to us, isn't it now? We have a piece in it. I believe this COVID crisis and this racial problems we're having, that we've had, and the reaction to it, it's moving us closer to world peace. I believe in the aftermath of this, we'll be closer to world peace. I think that the idea that we're one human family, it's inevitable that we realize this. And also the bankruptcy of the existing solutions is coming out. The inequities, someone pointed out the inequities that COVID is showing us. What COVID is showing us is some of the failures of our current systems, that our current systems are failing, or on the edge of failing. And so I think that we are inevitably going to get to peace. Whether we get there, it's in the Baha'i writings, I forget, I wish I had the exact term memorized, but essentially, whether it's a collective will that gets us there or just terrible calamities, we're going to get there sooner or later. I would prefer collective will, an active collective will. I think it would be much better for humanity, but the other choice is God will get us there one way or another. We will have peace. I think we're much better off to do it voluntarily. And so I think that if we work hard together, each one of us doing everything we can, we'll get there faster. So I think everyone has to do everything they can. Baha'u'llah says, take a world-embracing view. I try to do that every day. I encourage everyone I meet to do that every day. Encourage everyone you meet to be not to think of their tribe, not to think of their family, not to think of their city or state or their country, but to take a world embracing view every time they get up in the morning. And as we change hearts, we can get to peace. I don't think we're going to get to world peace today or tomorrow. I do think we're coming into it. A couple things I'd say. I think we're coming to a time where we're going to have a huge number of Baha'is. And I do think that the more Baha'is we have, the closer we will be to peace. The other thing that I think is really interesting right now is we're coming up to the 100th year of Abdul Baha's ascension, his passing away. And at the same time, we're building the shrine of Abdul Baha in Israel. And that to me is a big thing, because that's a coming out party for Baha'is in Israel. That's a very, very public thing. And Baha'is have been very quiet in Israel. And I think that tells me a lot about where the faith is going.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Well,
maybe a little bit. You talked about I think of the COVID particularly, that it's a blessing and we'll go forward. It just at least personally, I mean, I've been healthy, but my life has shrunk down to like nothing in terms of, I don't go out, and if it weren't for these few Zoom meetings I'm just starting to do, I don't have a lot of contact. In the spring, I pretty much sat outside till I was really tan because I couldn't stand to just sit inside. It just seems like, I've lost so many, not just me, but many people. And the things that you've lost are simple, beautiful things like meeting friends, going out to lunch with somebody, having dog meetups. I love dogs. All those things are gone. I mean, they weren't like wild parties or things that were materialistic or, those aren't the things that I mourn losing. I mean, it's true, you have fewer materialistic people and you don't go anywhere, but it's all those simple pleasures, those beautiful little things, they're gone. That was a huge loss.
Well, I think that when I said that COVID was a blessing, what I mean is it's a curse and a blessing. The curse is this calamity. My calamity is my providence. Outwardly, it is fire and vengeance. So on the outward side, it's all bad. People are dying. 600,000 people have died all around the world. It's been very hard on families, and particularly Black and brown families in this country. A lot of people have died. A lot of people have suffered. So underneath every curse, according to Baha'u'llah, there's also light and mercy. And the light and mercy, I believe, is this idea that we're one human family, this idea that we're one world, because it's very hard for anyone to look at this and say that the world isn't very closely connected. That if something happens in China, it's not going to affect us all around the world. And so the aftermath of this, I believe, will be much greater care to think that maybe something in China affects me. Maybe I should care about the Chinese. Maybe I should care about, people all across the world. I was just reading the Baha'i writings today about the interconnectedness of all things. And so that's what this is teaching us, is the interconnectedness of all things. I'm not saying that COVID is a pretty thing, but what I am saying is that we have lessons to learn from it, and these lessons are very important. That's really what I meant. The blessing is the lesson.
And it would be God's way that the blessing supposedly is painful and is that the path? Is it like I don't know, I can't think of the words right, but learning by fire, or we're gonna make you learn, or else we're gonna.
Here's the way I would describe that. We blame God for a lot of things, and I always say it this way: God has told us not to murder, yet we still murder. God has told us not to steal, but we still steal. God told us in every book not to lie, not to cheat, not to rape, to love our neighbors at all times. Now imagine a world where we actually listen to God. If we listen to God, God has told us in this age to be unified. So if we listen to God, we would have none of these problems, or very few problems. So I don't think the issue is God. I don't think that God wants to punish us. I think God is loving and merciful. In fact, the Baha'i writing says 100% love and 100% mercy. God is all good. Evil is simply the lack of good. Darkness is the lack of light. And so we put darkness in our lives by turning away from God. We put evil in our lives by turning away from God. And so if the COVID encourages us to turn to God, which again, we talked about earlier tonight, that we're turning away from God, so much the better. So hopefully, if this causes us to turn to God, that's a very good result. I don't think that it's necessarily a pretty thing. I never blame God for anything because I do believe in God is all good. It's us. And because God is good and God is generous, that peace will come. We can help it along by loving each other and by teaching each other and by turning towards God.
I really appreciate it. On behalf of everybody, I thank you and thank for the contribution that the audience made to the discussion. That was wonderful. And also I want to thank Baha'in for taking the initiative and being brave to call you and arrange that. Thank you very much.